In verse 18, or let's look at verse 17, just for context. Verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and no spare, and I perish from hunger? If you're taking notes, underline or write down when he came to himself. When he came to himself. Just for a moment, look at your neighbor and say, isn't it time you came to yourself? Look at somebody else and say, isn't it really time you came to yourself? Hallelujah. You see, there are some things that we can't see or acknowledge or recognize until we come to ourselves. And what God is saying here is, as long as you're outside of my will and doing something completely opposed to what I told you to do, you are not yourself. That's not the self I saved. That's not the self I delivered. That's not the self that my spirit abides in. But you're still a son. When he came to himself, he was still a son. Isn't that good news? You know what that means? There's grace for me when I'm out there. I don't know about you, but I need grace when I'm out there. Sometimes we don't realize when I'm out there is when I need grace. When all is well with my soul and everything is right, I'm sitting in church doing what I'm supposed to be doing and everything, that's not when I really need that much grace. I need grace sometime when I'm out there. When I'm out there. And, I can be out there and not know I'm out there. Because there's a way that seemeth right to a man. Hallelujah. I can just think I'm out. It's all right. I got it like that. I told you a few weeks ago, the Lord told me that if I had done a certain thing, I would be sowing to the flesh and reacting like a heathen does. I told y'all the story. And when he said to me, he said, the heathen says, when I get it right, I'll come to God. The heathen says, when I get everything right, I'll be back in church. That's the spirit of the heathen. That's the spirit of the world. When I get it all together. Now, don't raise your hand. But I believe it's some people in here that's been through some things, and you decided, well, as soon as I get it all together, I'll go back to church. Because, I really don't want nobody to ask me what's going on. I don't want nobody to say, and remember what we told you, the longer you're out, the easier it is to stay out. And what you're saying is, when I can get it all together, not when I submit it all to God, but when I get it all together. So he says, I came to myself. And then in verse 18, now this is what he said to himself. Look at your neighbor and say, he's still talking to himself. He said, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. In other words, on Sunday we said I was wrong. Has anybody said I was wrong since Sunday? Did you, tell the truth. When you said I was wrong, I'm looking at all the hands up there too. Didn't you feel something trigger on the inside of you? Did you see the difference in saying, I'm sorry and I was wrong? Wasn't that a powerful revelation? You can be sorry. You can cuss somebody out on the way to church. Say you're sorry before you walk in and cuss them out on the way home. Because you said you were sorry, but you never said you were wrong. So there was a reason you said what you said. You made me mad. And it's always somebody else's fault that you said what you said. You notice it's never your fault. It's somebody else's fault. So they made me that mad. And God, I'm so grateful that you were with me on that hogwash. But when I say I was wrong, it comes from another perspective. It releases something. The world would say an endorphin, but it really is an endorphin. It releases something that we call grace. And that grace floods my soul. And all of a sudden something happened, and now I know he touched me. He touched my soul so that I could say I was wrong and no longer be condemned. There was a time when I said I was wrong, I had to be condemned. I didn't want anybody to know I was wrong. I had to walk around and act like, I don't know what they'd think if I was wrong. Now I could say I was wrong, and you can't hold me to what I did wrong. because grace comes in and floods my soul. Verse 18, he's talking to himself. He hasn't said this to anybody yet. But, and I am no longer worthy to be called, he says, I'll arise and I'll go. And he makes his declaration, I'm no longer worthy to be your son. We told you in verse 19. That's the world's thinking. You need to write that down. Right in the middle of you realizing you're wrong, you still got some world in you. Soon as you admit you're wrong, the whole spirit of the world doesn't go away. That's the world speaking. He said, make me like one of the hired servants. Verse 20, he arose and came to his father. Okay, right in the middle of verse 20. But when he was still a great way off, say before he got close to his father, before he said anything, say, I don't have to say anything when my heart really changes. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Before he said anything, what did the father do? The father ran toward him. The point of this is God is ready to run toward you with grace, with love, with forgiveness, with acceptance. But he's not running to you as long as you're making excuses for what you did wrong. As soon as you say in your heart, I was wrong. I sinned against you, God, and against your father, your mother, your order, your church, your boss, whoever, your wife, your husband, your family, whoever you sinned against. As soon as you release that, God is waiting. He's running now. In other words, he says, Grace, go engulf him. Grace, go get him. Grace, go wrap your arms around him. That's why the old folks used to say, if we take one step, he'll take two. They meant as soon as you took the step toward him, acknowledging you're wrong and you had sinned, he says, Grace, go get him. Grace, go get him. Grace, go get him. Grace, flood their soul. Grace, wrap your arms around them. Grace, pick them up out of the miry clay. Grace, lift them up. The enemy thinks he got a trap laid for him. He thinks they're walking toward the trap. Here comes grace. Here comes grace. Grace lifts you up far above. Hallelujah. That's why it's amazing grace. We can't figure out where it came from, but we know who sent it. You need to understand, God, when you take the position of humility, when you come to yourself, the Father is right there. Now, listen, let me just ask you this. I wonder what would happen if he had never come to himself. Look back at your neighbor and say, it's time for you to come to yourself. Look at verse 24. Look what the father said. Bring the fatted calf. We're getting ready to have a party. Verse 24. For this my son was what? This my son was what? Now, what did we ask you Sunday? Did they carry him in on a stretcher? But yet God said he was dead. He said he's my son, but he's dead. How many of us are walking around dead? Because we are completely out of the will of God and are doing our own thing. And God is looking at us saying they're dead. They're my son, but they're still dead.